Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the annual Linder Center for Social Justice Community Conversation, Police Bodies, a Conversation on Race, Disability, and Justice. I want to begin by first acknowledging with respect the Onondaga Nation, Firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. My name is Marcelle Haddix. I am a faculty member in the School of Education at Syracuse University and one of the co-directors of the Linder Center for Social Justice, along with my colleague, Kendall Phillips, who you will hear from shortly. We are living in dangerous times, to quote James Baldwin from his talk with teachers almost 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, excuse me. Even during a global pandemic, our country's allegiance to its deep history of enslaving and killing Black, Brown, and Indigenous people resurges again and again. We live in a world that would have us think that Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, disabled, queer, and transgender people do not matter in the past, present, or future. In fact, racial violence never left, and millions around the world are calling for systemic and material changes. How do we make sense of all that is going on in this country, even right now? Our hope is that the events over the next 2 days will provide a space for learning, for processing, understanding, changing, and even healing. I also just want to invite those of you being in community with us today to check in with yourselves right now. How do you feel? How is your body, your mind, your heart? As I said, we stay living through some troubling times. And I know that it can feel like, at least I know for me, it feels like we're just holding our breath, waiting for what is next. So I just ask that you be kind and you have grace for yourselves, that you take time and you embrace peace and joy too, even through and with the trauma and the pain that we are dealing with and deal with on a regular basis. We want to thank everyone who has been involved in the planning of today's events and tomorrow's events. I also want to recognize the School of Education and Dean Joanna Masangila for her continued support of the Linder Center. And I want to express deep appreciation and sincere gratitude to Helene and Marvin Linder. It is their vision, their persistence, and their generosity that has helped us to shape and move the Linder Center for Social Justice forward. This year's conversation is presented in collaboration with the School of Education's Landscape on Urban Education lecture series, and also with the new Center on Disability and Inclusion. We are appreciative of the opportunity to work together to amplify issues of race, disability, and justice in the conversation on policing with our colleagues. I would like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Christine Ashby, Associate Professor in the Department of Teaching and Leadership in the School of Education, and the Director for the Center on Disability and Inclusion, to share a few words. Christy.
Thank you, Marcelle, and welcome everyone. Along with CDI Assistant Director Beth Myers, I want to welcome you to this critical and timely conversation. As Marcelle said, the CDI is a new School of Education center working to promote the inclusion of disabled people in all aspects of schools and society. But while the CDI as an overarching structure is new, it brings together and builds on groundbreaking work of historical centers and institutes that addressed issues such as deinstitutionalization, community living, and inclusive education at all levels. Disabled people have faced and continue to face suspicion, hypersurveillance, marginalization, segregation, and violence in the name of therapy and protection. And the lived experience of disability is inextricably linked with discourses and practices of racism, classism, sexism, and heterosexism. We are grateful for this partnership with the Lender Center and the opportunity to be part of this intersectional consideration of the material realities of policing. In these uncertain and frightening times, these collaborative coalitions are more vital than ever. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Kendall Phillips, professor in the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies in the College of Visual and Performing Arts and co-director of the Lender Center for Social Justice. Kendall?
Thank you, Professor Ashby. Today's important event marks a crucial moment for our community and for our nation. It also marks an important moment for the Lender Center for Social Justice, the end of Dr. Marcel Haddix's term as our co-director. Here to offer their appreciation for the incomparable work of Dr. Haddix is the Dean of the School of Education, Dr. Joanna Massangila.
Thank you, Kendall. Marcel, your co-directorship of the Lender Center has been representative of your dynamic scholarship and commitment to community engagement and the voices of young people. On behalf of the School of Education, I want to share that I am directing a donation in your honor from the Dean's Office to Writing Our Lives, the initiative you founded for youth writers in Syracuse in 2009. Thank you for all you've done to launch and co-lead the Lender Center for Social Justice. Now I will give the Zoom floor to Marvin and Helene Lender, whose vision and generosity has made the Lender Center possible.
It's our pleasure to be here, and thank you. What does it take to bring a dream to reality? Like all other challenges and hurdles, it takes people, great people, people who have vision, strength, passion, and commitment. Syracuse University, through its School of Education and the Lender family, were fortunate to attract the very best of the best to be the inaugural co-directors of the Lender Center for Social Justice. Marcel Haddix, along with her partner in crime, Kendall Phillips, were tasked with the formulating and creating a working model and plan for the center and developing the exciting model which we're using today. We will forever be grateful for their hard work, creativity, and commitment to our project. When we created the center, we knew that these directors could not be there forever. And sadly, now comes the moment of truth when we have to say goodbye and thank you to one of them.
Marcel Haddix is a very special person. We knew that from the very beginning, just looking at her CV. But upon meeting her, it became obvious that we hit the jackpot when she agreed to help launch this important center at Syracuse University. We have told her privately, but now publicly, how appreciative we are for what she has developed and accomplished along with Kendall during these first 4 years. I guess we are living proof of the age-old adage, it's never too late to learn. Marcel has taught us so much about the power of people who care, who have a vision and understanding of the world around her. Both Helene and I have always been committed to making the world a better place. And Marcel's passion, intellect, and commitment to doing the same is evident in how our center is now structured. Marcel is not just a teacher, but a doer as well. She has the vision, while at the same time, she knows how to get the job done. She has truly left her mark on this center, and that will go on in perpetuity. So Marcel, from the bottom of our hearts, the Lender family thanks you for what you have accomplished in making our dream a reality. The Lender Center for Social Justice is where it is today because of you. We are lucky to now call you a very dear friend, And please know that you will forever be part of the Lender Center, and you will always be part of both of our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvin Lane and Joanna. And here is a small token, if you can see it on my screen, of the center's appreciation that we will deliver to Dr. Haddix to remind her of her many accomplishments during her time with the Lender Center. And I guess I'll say for my part, time does not permit me to say enough about my appreciation for all that my friend and colleague, Dr. Haddix, has done for the center. Suffice it to say, the Lender Center would not be what it is today, and perhaps might not even exist were it not for her fierce intellect, her deep ethical commitments, her skilled leadership. I am deeply grateful and humbled to have worked with her. And now it is my distinct pleasure to hand the screen over to the Dean's Professor and Chair of Reading and Language Arts and the founding co-director of the Lender Center for Social Justice, my friend, Dr. Marcel Haddix.
Thank you all so much. I am overwhelmed, one, just by your kind words, and I've really appreciated the opportunity to be a part of this vision and this initiative. And just thank you for your support. I really am overwhelmed. So you'll hear from me later. But now, before I introduce the keynote address, I want to remind everyone of a few housekeeping notes for those of you who are joining us today. As a reminder, ASL and live captioning are available. You should know that we are recording this event. As the panels get going, if you have questions, you'll see the Q&A function in Zoom. So please jot down your questions, share them so that you can be a part of this conversation. We will have quick breaks in between sessions. You do not need to sign out or back in during today's events. We will keep this webinar open throughout the day. So feel free to get up and walk away from the screen, take your breaks as you need. And then also we'll remind you of this at the end of today's events. For those of you that are joining us tomorrow morning, there's a different link for tomorrow. So it is my honor to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Monique Morris. Dr. Morris is an award-winning author and social justice scholar with 3 decades of experience in the areas of education, civil rights, juvenile, and social justice. Her research intersects race, gender, education, and justice to explore the ways in which Black communities and other communities of color are uniquely affected by social policies. She is the executive producer and co-writer of the 2019 documentary film, Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, which is based on her books, Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, Education for the Liberation of Black and Brown Girls, and Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. Dr. Morris is the founder and president of the National Black Women's Justice Institute, an organization that works to interrupt school to confinement pathways for girls, reduce the barriers to employment for formerly incarcerated women, and increase the capacity of organizations working to reduce sexual assault and domestic violence in African-American communities. Her work has been profiled by MSNBC, C-SPAN 2, The Washington Post, TED, The New York Times, Essence Magazine, NPR, PBS, and we could go on and on. And I was delighted to learn that she also frequently lectures on the life and legacy of the dearly beloved artist, Prince. So that was something really interesting to me. Dr. Morris, I was so excited that you accepted the invitation to be a part of this event. Thank you for being with us this afternoon and helping us to provide a framing for what will be a very important conversation. Everyone, let's welcome Dr. Morris.
Thank you, Dr. Haddix. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to join today to talk about policed bodies of our Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities and students. As likely expected, I want to center Black girls in my time with you all. I had the pleasure of visiting Syracuse when my book Push Out was first published, and I'm happy to be back again with you today, dialing in from Brooklyn, what is ancestrally Canarsie and Munsee Lenape land. I want to just offer that since I guess you received my bio, I became president and CEO of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, and now am the board chair for the National Black Women's Justice Institute. And at Grantmakers for Girls of Color, we are an organization, a philanthropic organization that seeks to resource positive, just, and liberated futures for girls of color. So happy to be moving into that space at this time. It's been about a year now, but very thrilled to still be here in essentially a new space. I want to start by acknowledging how difficult these conversations are on a normal day in this nation, but especially during these times when so many incidents of state-sanctioned violence and police-involved shootings are front and center in our consciousness. It's also, it's certainly the right time to engage this discussion. It's also the right time to take care of ourselves because this is re-traumatizing our mental and physical health. And so as we continue to call for justice, I just want to remind everyone to please drink water, sleep, take care of yourself as you need to in the course of this conversation. When we talk about policing the Black body, what we're largely talking about are the ways in which Black bodies, in this case, Black children's bodies, are problematized. So what does that mean? Problematizing something is to make it a problem. It is an acknowledgement that it is not inherently a problem, but that in the context of specific questions, decisions, structures, and actions, it becomes a problem requiring solution. This is important to state outright because Black bodies are not problematic. White supremacist ideologies, practices, institutions, and structures problematize Black people's bodies in order to present them as being in need of a solution or remedy. But let me start by offering to you all, particularly in this conversation about policing, that Black bodies do not require remedy. Black bodies do not require remedy. White supremacy and the unearned privileges of whiteness as it manifests in our nation require remedy. When a 9-year-old Black girl has to remind law enforcement officers that she is indeed a child, as was the case recently in an incident in Rochester, we're bearing witness to how these unearned privileges problematize Black children, shape their lived experiences, and strip them of their human right to have their cognitive development received as age appropriate. One of my favorite contemporary artists is Kerry James Marshall, who paints figures using a unique color of Black that he mixes himself in order to intentionally disrupt the absence of Blackness with a capital B on the canvas and in the fine artistic canon. This intentional centering of the Black body has also been a core part of my work, which has largely been about locating the Black body in educational and juvenile court settings. All of this is a labor toward rehumanizing Black people in the public domain, Black children, Black girls, boys, and non-binary young folks who are uniquely experiencing the vestiges of slavery in our institutions and in our society at large. Let's talk a little about how Black girl bodies have been problematized in schools. I offer a number of ways that Black girls experienced being problematized in schools in my articles, papers, books, and film addressing the topic. But for this discussion, I want to highlight 3 primary ways that Black girl bodies and Black girlhood are problematized in schools. First, Black girls experience adultification in schools. Dr. Jamelia Blake and the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality found that the behaviors of Black girls are received as more adult-like than their white counterparts, which can lead to the perception that they need less protection, less comfort, and nurturing. They're read to be more independent than white girls and to know more about sex and other adult subject matter. They found that the adultification bias begins when Black girls are as young as age 5, and that the disparity increases and peaks as they get older, ultimately peaking when they're between the ages of 10 and 14. So late elementary and middle schools. This adultification certainly impacts girls in their communities. Black girls experience disproportionately high rates of sexual, physical, and emotional violence, and they are disproportionately impacted by conditions of poverty and criminalization that also facilitate a blurring and sometimes an erasure of their girlhood. But they also experience it in schools. Adultification impacts Black girls in how adults read and police, with and without badges, their bodies in schools. This adultification happens through surveillance and reading Black girl bodies for their degree of provocation within the mandates or set parameters of a given dress code. This adultification happens when adults dismiss the behaviors of Black girls as inexplicably combative, which is then used to justify providing less opportunity for recovery and reconciliation when conflicts occur. Students who are disruptive are students who are experiencing disruption. And that's important for us to remember. In fact, we can't ever lose sight of it in education or elsewhere. The second issue I want to highlight in terms of how Black girl bodies are problematized is not just the prevalence of trauma and abuse, but the failure to recognize trauma as an underlying factor in the disruptive behaviors that manifest in schools. Too many of our institutions across the country respond to Black girls who experience traumatic events by suspending them for willful defiance, or even worse, criminalizing them through what are called disturbing schools laws. Earlier this year, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, new cases were reported of Black girls being forcefully handled by law enforcement. They began to circulate on social media and ultimately in some of the more mainstream news outlets, including a devastating one of a teenage girl in Florida who was lifted by an officer, slammed to the concrete, and then handcuffed while she lay unconscious on the ground. We become aware of the most egregious cases involving law enforcement that fail to respond to Black girls in crises through media, but what usually floats under our radar is the routine ways in which schools are participating in problematizing Black girl bodies by relying on exclusionary discipline to respond to conditions that would be better addressed by counselors, clinicians, and strong youth development partners. And yes, while an increasing number of schools are developing alternative practices designed to divert students from exclusionary discipline, we know that the racial disparities persist among those who remain along the pathways to confinement. The most recent analysis of national school data on school discipline conducted by the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality found that Black girls are approximately 4 times more likely than white girls to face suspension and expulsion, and are 3.5 times more likely to be transferred to an alternative school for disciplinary reasons. It's also worth noting that across the spectrum of discipline, Black girls continue to experience a greater racial disparity than their male counterparts. For example, Black boys are nearly 2.6 times more likely than white boys to experience suspension, while Black girls are 4 times more likely than white girls to experience suspension. Black boys are just under 2.5 times more likely than white boys to be arrested on campus, while Black girls are 3.6 times more likely than white girls to experience the same. I offer these statistics to uplift why it is important that we continue to employ an intersectional lens when addressing issues like push-out and policing, which leads me ultimately to the third issue that I want to highlight as a contributing factor to the way Black girl bodies are being problematized in schools, and that is neglect. Rendering Black girls as absent from or invisible in the narrative of excellence is a form of erasure that signals to them and to everyone else that they don't matter. I wrote in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues that building and implementing a curriculum that only acknowledges Black people during Black History Month or via elective coursework, or that teaches only narratives about enslavement or exceptionalism is part of the tapestry of harm. I specifically call this teaching to the oppression. of Black girls. And I do so because it limits their location in broader subject matter and feeds a savior mentality among educators that does not allow for Black girls to recognize and realize their own wisdom and learning capacity. So how do we move towards schools that do not problematize Black girl bodies? I say everywhere I possibly can that schools need to be locations for healing so that they can be locations for learning. My work and the call to action for all of us, ultimately, in my mind, is for us to explore why we should pull students in closer when they are in crisis rather than push them away. Our reflex to banish when young people make mistakes concretizes schools as part of the tapestry of harm, and we can't do that. Over and over again, when we engage with young people, we hear them describe their schools as prisons. It feels like a prison, they'll say, or I don't want to go to school because I have to walk through systems that make me feel like I'm going to jail. When I ask students, particularly girls, what they want in a school, they say, I want my school to be a sanctuary. What we do to prepare an institution of learning to be a sanctuary is radically different than what we do to prepare an institution to be a prison. To be part of the tapestry of healing, schools must do a better job of understanding the need for trauma-responsive interventions that avoid becoming what I call maladaptive classrooms in Singer Rhythm Dance Blues, or those classrooms that respond to violence with more violence. Schools must instead map the margins for our most vulnerable students and recognize that these students who identify along a gender continuum, students who are surviving carceral systems and who are impacted by child welfare systems, for their learning communities to recognize and respond to these challenges with love and not with fear. Schools need to become locations for healing, and they do so when they replace law enforcement with counselors, clinicians, and other youth development specialists, as I've said before. I partnered with Rebecca Epstein and the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality a few years back to write a toolkit about school resource officers and girls of color. And we found that not only were law enforcement strategies in schools arbitrary, but that in the structures of law enforcement as well as their strategies were arbitrary, but that in too many instances, police in schools were never trained to address the specific factors that contribute to negative student behavior among girls of color, nor were they particularly interested in having that take place. And I'm not suggesting that training is the panacea. Actually, I've said in multiple settings that I do not believe that police should be in schools. In fact, throughout the report, we state that the toolkit is not an endorsement of police in schools, but rather an effort to guide officers currently in schools toward practices that do not exacerbate harm. In my opinion, the most important finding from that report was that officers and girls of color agreed together. They agreed that what determined school resource officer effectiveness in schools was their capacity to be strong youth development workers, not their badge or their gun. The more adults connected with youth, understood their home communities, and responded to underlying issues associated with poverty, the more students trusted these adults and believed that they were sources of safety. Safety ultimately is co-constructed, not implemented, and does not require a police escort. Schools have to build curricula and other school-based structures that don't teach to the oppression, but rather root their instruction in a rigorous intersectional framework that uplifts opportunities for education to be a tool for the collective liberation of all our students. And when I say intersectional framework, oftentimes when we hear this term intersectionality, we tend to think about it really only being about the identification of one's multiple identities. And it's so much more than just identifying that someone exists with multiple identities. It's about recognizing that these multiple identities never disappear from one's experience, and that in fact they shape an individual's interactions with systems, policies, structures, and individuals. Never at any time do our students just walk through life as a single identity. And therefore, as they are encountering individuals, as they are encountering institutions, they are experiencing these institutions accordingly. And it's important for us to think about the rigor that is required for us to develop frameworks that acknowledge that young people are walking through systems with these multiple identities, and that we cannot simply say that one approach is effective for all students. That's not it. That is particularly why the erasure of girls and women in concepts, engagements around policing has been another form of violence taking place in our communities. That erasure does significant harm because it allows for the disconnect to fester. It allows for the opportunity for an entire body of our community who is experiencing harm not to have their harm recognized and remedied. And so I want to emphasize that when we're talking about building out curricular and school-based structures that don't teach to the oppression, that in an engagement of an intersectional framework that uplifts, again, the opportunities for education to be a tool for collective liberation for all of our students, means that we have to more deeply examine how we are confronting issues, how we are framing them even, such that we can better understand how multiple communities are impacted by them. When I first started talking about Push Out, I talked largely about it in the context of trying to locate Black girls in what we were calling the school to prison pipeline. And in my work, I found that by simply referring to it, even though I understand the urgency of calling it a school to prison pipeline, but simply referring to it as a pipeline or highlighting school to prison, we were effectively rendering the experiences of Black girls invisible, because we weren't taking into account all of the complex ways in which Black girls have a unique relationship with others that can place them at harm of future contact with the juvenile court and criminal legal system. So I started calling it school to confinement pathways. One, because I wanted to make sure that we were identifying the systems where we actually see the criminalization of our girls take place in structures of confinement, but also to recognize that there are multiple pathways, not a singular pipeline, that we need to be aware of as we are constructing responses and interventions to remedy this grand scale issue. So when I talk about school to confinement pathways, or when I'm talking about school push out, what I'm talking about are the policies, the practices, the conditions, and the prevailing consciousness. So what we think about Black girls that renders them vulnerable to future contact with the juvenile court and criminal legal system. All of that shows up certainly in the practices that we have around our responses to school discipline, or our efforts to bring girls into community around where there has been a degree of conflict, but it also has to do with what we're teaching and how we are shaping the entire learning community to be either responsive to their conditions and inclusive of their narratives, or dismissive of those very same narratives. Educational systems have to be a bridge. They have to bridge the research-based best practices on how to counter the criminalization taking place in schools with the design of the school day and the curriculum itself. We have to implement affinity spaces in learning communities, increase funding for culturally competent counselors and volunteers who can help support educators' capacity for positive relationship building and empathetic responses to student misbehavior. The instances that we see around the country where young people are being invited to co-construct policies, or that are being invited to be a part of conversations that center their well-being with adults in their space, those are the places where they're the safest. And the places that have school leaders that are overwhelmingly preoccupied with discipline, or that are preoccupied with duplicating in many ways the structures, behaviors, and practices of carceral systems, are the places where young people feel they're most unsafe. We should not be walking through educational systems where young people are behaving as if they are in juvenile hall. We should not be watching them line up, hands behind their backs, disallowing for the freedom that young people need to move with each other through hallways. The replication of so much of the structure of carceral systems is a form of priming. That is a very dangerous way to enter into a school. And it's a very dangerous way to enter conversations about facilitating well-being. Schools, to me, are about deeply investing in the learning capacity of young people such that they can be strong adult citizens who are participants in our economy, participants in our communities, leaders of families in very concrete ways, not priming them for a future in a carceral system. This is very important because how we design our schools matters. Our students matter. And designing them with healing in mind requires something else from us. There's a need for us to be, in a deeper, more rigorous assessment of biases among the adults that we trust to educate and surround Black youth and other students of color in schools, and to include in assessments of effectiveness a measure of their commitment to mitigate bias through their own continued development in this area. There are a number of school districts that have started to look at how we are addressing bias, how we're thinking about our own practices and our own understandings in these areas. And I applaud these efforts. This is very hard work. One of the reasons that there's so much resistance to conversations about structural and individual bias is because it is deeply personal, hard work that impacts how we are designing schools, how we are engaging with young people, what our expectations are, and how we are structuring and aligning our behaviors with those ideas that we have cultivated for young people, which is why when I'm talking about push out, I talk about the policies, the practices, the conditions, and the prevailing consciousness that informs how we are engaging with young people that can either be part of keeping them out of schools and thus be involved in what I call freedom work. Keep them out of prisons, I'm sorry, and thus be involved in the freedom work that I call attention to, or facilitate future contact with the juvenile court or criminal legal system. And we have to be intentional about what it is that we're creating. It doesn't just happen. We have to lead with intention. Schools need to offer yoga, mindfulness, restorative approaches. There are a host of interventions that are now available to us. I've been an evaluator of some of these programs. We know them to be effective in regulating students who have experienced trauma. We know them to be effective with students who are seeking reconciliation. We know them to be effective in learning more about how we construct schools that can actually perform as the sanctuaries our young people want and deserve. This is a non-exhaustive list, and there is great innovation happening around the country to receive Black girls as sacred and loved rather than as problematic. And we need more. One of the things that excites me about being at Grantmakers for Girls of Color is that we have developed a possibility of investing in these liberated futures by supporting organizations and communities that are wrapping their arms around girls of color, really thinking intersectionally, but certainly quite rigorously and innovatively about how to facilitate the kinds of healing programs and practices that we know can combat the larger structure of criminalization that impacts too many. But we need institutional partners. Our organizations need institutional partners. Our organizations need educators in schools who recognize and appreciate that the current direction of school discipline and the conflation between accountability and discipline is something that we have to dismantle, that we need to invest in creating spaces where young people feel safe enough to learn, that they actually believe that they are wanted in schools, understand themselves to be a core part of constructing the learning in the school in order for us to build out the kinds of learning spaces that we ultimately want and that our young people deserve. We have to recognize that while we are having this conversation about policing the bodies of young people in schools, that this is not happening everywhere. It happens disproportionately in Black and brown schools. It happens disproportionately in low income neighborhoods. It happens disproportionately in the spaces that are living with the deepest levels of structural bias and harm, and that are living with the ongoing vestiges of oppression. And that many of our girls and our boys and other non-binary youth are living at the intersections of these multiple streams of oppression, and that in our current space, they are going to be coming back to school, or in some cases have already returned to school, having lived through the additional trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic, where Black and Brown communities were disproportionately impacted, disproportionately experienced fatalities as a function of the biases and discriminatory practices in healthcare, that they are ultimately experiencing, all of us, the collective trauma of having been removed from their learning space, and in some cases, in deep dysregulation with their learning process. And so it is important for us to amplify all the ways in which we can be responsive to trauma now more than ever. That this means that we cannot rely on law enforcement to handle the things that we have put on their plate in schools, that we have to think more creatively, we have to be smarter, we have to be more rigorous in our approach to safety and our understanding of safety. And we do that largely by having conversations with those who are at the center of this inquiry. Much of my work has been about participatory structures. We were fortunate enough to resource 17 organizations through Grantmakers for Girls of Color who are leading youth participatory action research, looking at girls of color and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we'll be sharing out in the future. But the idea is that we have to have conversations with young people in order to understand what their experiences are. And that co-construction is ultimately about recognizing that whether we acknowledge it or not, young people are going to help us in the design of our schools and in the design of how discipline plays out in our schools, and the design of whether or not we are going to have learning institutions that are ultimately about being part of a tapestry of healing, or if we are going to design them to be continuing along this path of harm. And so it is really important for us to continue to invest in more, but it's also important for us to challenge ourselves to think about how we are constructing narratives about Black girls, about the bodies of young people that we feel invites us into a conversation about this issue of safety without their input. I think when we think about Black girls and we think about Black youth bodies, it's really important, I think, for us to explore how historically Black girlhood has been shaped largely by the public reading of their bodies. That from the early experiences of their ancestors who faced enslavement in this land, who have continued to face surveillance in communities, who have been positioned as public in so many ways, that to have a conversation about policing where there is a reclamation of the privacy of one's body, a reclamation of one's right to grow and live without assault, is a radical action. I often will, when I talk to girls, uplift how their education and their success in educational environments is an act of self, reclamation, but certainly is a radical act that is associated with healing, because so much of the Black girl body is perceived to be available to everyone. We see it in our cultural practices through music and entertainment. We see it in the way that adults look at, read, and judge Black girl bodies. It's something that was brought to my attention in the early portions of the research that I was doing for Push Out, where so many Black girls would talk about how their bodies were policed by school administrators, that they were deemed to be provocative, even if they were not fully developed. One girl said to me, it doesn't matter if I'm skinny or if I'm thick, essentially because I'm a Black girl, they're gonna see me as provocative. They're gonna see me as sexy. And, I have often challenged adults to check yourselves. We have to check ourselves to recognize that there should be nothing sexy about a girl body. And it's not our place to present with her some of the elements of rape culture that invite us to police her body, that invite us to explore whether her body, the way that it is in its natural state, her hair, her body, whether that's appropriate for school, that her presence in school and her ability to be in school is what we should be spending time on, and developing clear parameters around what it is to respect individuals, regardless of what they have on their bodies, that should be the central part of what we are examining, not reinforcing the stereotypes and the tropes around Black female sexuality that play out and unfortunately contribute to the adultification of so many Black girls. Now is the time, ultimately, for us to get in the trenches, to get in the weeds, to develop structures for equity that support the development of these rigorous intersectional frameworks and tools that provide a structure for us to reimagine education as a public health issue, requiring that our schools increase their capacity to serve as locations for healing. Young people around the country tell me, I don't care what you want to teach me until I know that you care about me. They don't want to know what we have to teach until they know that we care. Criminalization is what we produce when we lead with fear, and it has ultimately communicated to young people that we don't care, that we can replace them, that they are disposable. Liberation is what we get when we lead with love. That is the anchor of transformation. So as you move forward with the conference, I know we'll have some time for Q&A. It's my invitation, really, for you to join me in pressing for movement toward the latter, toward liberation. And so with that, I think I want to turn to the Q&A and engage in responding to some of your direct questions, but I thank you so much for your time. I'm looking for a few of the questions, if there are any. Okay, I see one question that says, if you feel that Black History Month is perpetuating the separation of race, do you think it should not be celebrated at all? Let me clarify what I was saying, because I was actually not saying that Black History Month is perpetuating the separation of race. I wasn't saying that at all. I believe that Black History Month is a necessary reminder in our society that this construction of our community, our understanding of ourselves, even as a society, is partially developed by people of African descent. Black History Month grew out of Negro History Week and has since allowed for us to engage in a body of conversations about the contributions of Black people. What I was saying is that limiting our engagement of an acknowledgement of Black people's identities to a single month, or in the curriculum only placing or saving every reading, savoring every conversation for February, does a disservice for us who are seeking for a more integrated approach to understanding, and a more realistic approach to understanding what the contributions have actually been and how we build out a more robust conversation about inclusion in our schools. Relegating, and also there are limitations to the structure of Black History Month, that often when we're talking in Black History Month, we elevate those who we either save the conversation to be about structures of oppression and engaging in conversations about enslavement, or we just do a spotlight on single individuals who usually fall into a particular framework around American exceptionalism or success via capitalism. And we highlight those individuals without fully engaging in a conversation about how their journeys were shaped, how they relate to other broader issues, and what that means for the promise of our young people. The invitation is for us to be more rigorous in our approach and not to save everything for February, but to also think along the way about how to be more inclusive in our curricula, such that we are able to explore concepts of liberation and oppression, that we are able to more ably conquer a full reading of a possibility, be it in mathematics and science, in other language arts and humanities and social studies and history, frameworks that allow for a deeper exploration. So I'm glad for the opportunity to clarify that, because what I'm saying here is that we teach to the oppression by only relegating ourselves to narrow constructs of what it means to be a Black person in this society. And Black girls receive that. Black girls understand their girlhood in the context of that. And so and others do too. And so as we are thinking through what is required, what is elective, how we are engaging in special assemblies, to understand that there are opportunities for all of us to learn from each other in much more concrete ways, and that the centering of only a singular narrative that is largely centered around white men, or largely centered around cis hetero white men, to be more specific, that also does a disservice to our collective understanding of what we are talking about when we engage in this broader community of learning. The next question I see is, thank you for centering Black girls. Why did you choose to focus on us? I feel that Black girls are worthy of inquiry. So, period. The question, why focus on girls, has been a longstanding one. And it's interesting to me because often we ask that question only when we don't expect for it to occur. And we don't expect for it to occur because there's been this historic erasure of conditions that doesn't allow for us to center with any rigor or deep inquiry a community that is absolutely deserving of it. For years, Black girls were not received as worthy of inquiry. Black girls aged 12 to 17, there was almost nothing that centered Black girls in this way. We would adultify them by including them in research and literature focused on women, and really thinking about what some of the unique conditions are for girls became an interest of mine. Really, when I started to see data. I mean, I grew up a Black girl, so I was always interested in Black girls, and I'm the mother of 2 Black girls. So, this is personal as well as a professional interest, but it became a center around this question of push out and criminalization when I saw the data. And I saw that Black girls were the only group of girls who were disproportionately experiencing exclusionary discipline across the spectrum of discipline and at every educational level. So I know, having attended different types of schools, that Black girls are not the only girls who get in trouble. I know that Black girls are not the only group of girls who are experiencing types of specific harm. And so I wanted to know really what was contributing to that and how we could remedy it. One of the reasons I elevate participatory work and think about that as a strategy for us to move forward, and a worldview really, is because I recognize that those who are at the center of an inquiry really have the information that others don't about how to remedy it. This is about solutions. This is about finding remedy. This is about bringing us into a community of care that can ultimately change outcomes for the better. I said at the end of Push Out, spoiler alert, that I wanted 5 years from the time of writing it to see a much more robust body of literature on Black girls, that I was hopeful that Push Out wouldn't be the last book that was written about these issues, and that there is room for all of us to explore ourselves in the various ways that we show up in this work, to be more rigorous with our analysis. And it's worth saying that when I talk about Black girls, and the girls that I involve in my research are Black girls across the spectrum of Black girlhood. So there are cis and trans Black girls, there are Afro-Latina girls, there are mixed biracial with white girls, there are African girls, straight African-American girls, girls who are who identify as queer and LGBTQ. It's really important for me to understand that when we're talking about our communities, and to present that when we're talking about our communities, we're talking about us. All of us are sacred, and all of us are loved. Next question I see is, how do you see disability playing into perceptions or support of Black girls? Thank you for that question. When I talk about intersectional engagement, it is important to highlight that Black girls are, also girls with disabilities, and that disability rights are Black girl issues, right? There is data that show that among students who are experiencing school disciplinary action, that Black girls with disabilities are among the highest to receive exclusionary discipline. And that is something that has not been a dominant part of the discussion in some spheres. It has been a part of our thinking about remedy. There are certainly issues associated with underdiagnoses of conditions impacting Black girls and how we read their engagement. There are particular vulnerabilities that Black girls with diagnosed disabilities are, especially if they are also survivors of sexual violence and other conditions that we know to be facilitative of behaviors that can lead to exclusionary discipline, to be a problem because there is not this, again, rigorous engagement for how Black girls across the spectrum of their identities are impacting a policing of their bodies. I do include a narrative and push out from a young girl in the Midwest who was in a wheelchair and talked about how her triggers for misbehaving in school had to do with ridicule and teasing and bullying happening from other students, and that instead of addressing those issues, the responses would be to her or against her as the angry Black girl. And so again, Black girls with disabilities are not somehow shielded from the tropes and stereotypes that impact Black girls across the board. It's really important to understand that their identities become complex with their disability status and the status, and their intersections with other systems. But it is also really central to us reconciling how we think about Black girlhood in general and how we are living and sometimes unnecessarily projecting some of our own biases, all the time, unnecessarily projecting our biases against Black girls in ways that can be harmful to their well-being. So, there are, I think, there's room for a deeper exploration. I was part of a discussion about Black girls and disabilities for a commission on civil rights, which I talk a little bit about in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, where there was still this idea that no harm is committed. The way we talk about Black girls with disabilities, or the way we talk about students with disabilities in this context of policing, is that if their numbers are small, that it's okay. And I think it's important for us, especially those who are part of the School of Education, to recognize that every student should matter. An egregious act against one student is too many. And so, there is, more work that can be done there, certainly more protections that could be in place, more funding to support learning in this area. But ultimately, when we are exploring the things that need to be deconstructed and the ways that we construct conversations about equity in our equity policies and decisions, as well as the tools that we design, they should ultimately understand that the tropes and stereotypes about being combative, aggressive, sassy, et cetera, that impact Black girls across the board include Black girls with disabilities who, again, we see disproportionately show up among school discipline. Thank you for your work, Dr. Morris. How do you envision that we develop school leaders around the key points you've made, especially if they feel tied to the need of having SROs in their schools? Thank you for that question. I believe that school leaders must understand how safety is co-constructed. And to dig into the neuroscience, the research on the developing adolescent brain, to better understand what systems should be in place in order for that safety to be present that we all want for every student. And I think, what happens with so many educators and school leaders is that they are, they have a pressure to present, data that show that they are performing along a certain, rubric or in accordance with a certain rubric that ultimately have to do with things that, we have shaped our understanding to align with the presence of law enforcement, but it's just not true. One of the schools that we profile in the Push Out documentary and that I talk a little bit about in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues is a school out of Columbus, a middle school, a public middle school in Columbus that has implemented a host of other interventions that have done a tremendous job in improving truancy rates, in improving various statistics along the spectrum of discipline. And she did it largely, under the leadership of Principal Patton. She did it, by really restructuring the school day to understand that young people need a moment to connect when they're in school, making sure that every young person on campus had an adult on campus that she could be in community with, or that she could feel as her safe adult on campus. There's research to suggest that when young people have at least one adult on campus, the likelihood of them being in contact with any agent of law enforcement or in engaging in any exclusionary disciplinary practice reduces dramatically. And so it is just little things along the way, implementing a social emotional learning component to their work, really focusing on the relationship building and sisterhood work that could happen on campus. All of these things are the research-based best practices that sometimes are not a part of the narrative or part of how schools of education are orienting those who would be school leaders toward this much more effective direction of cultivating safety. And so I encourage those who are school leaders to do a little digging into how to align their practices, again, with the developing data on the developing adolescent brain, and also to think creatively about how to respond to the root causes associated with discipline. That's what happens when you talk straight. Excuse me. Okay. I'll try to get my voice back. Lots of talking these days. All right. Water is good. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. All right. Also, I think it's important for school leaders to know that school discipline is not the same as accountability. That those school leaders who rely on exclusionary discipline are actually cultivating spaces that are more unsafe for students. Those school leaders who are cultivating spaces that provide for the rebuilding of relationships, the connection with adults, those are the places that are safest for students. Okay, I am absolutely going to try to get through these questions without further losing my voice.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. I said, let me come in and see if I can give you a moment just to take some time.
Okay.
I see we have lots additional questions. We'll maybe take a couple more, but please, we'll take some time.
Okay. So let's see. I spoke about schools where students are allowed to define what makes their safe space. Are there program models of this that you are familiar with or recommend? How would a school go about implementing something along these lines? So there are definitely schools and school districts that have done some work to align their own practices with the intentions and desires of students. It's probably a much bigger process than I can answer in this Q&A, but I will say I highlight some of them in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues. I highlight some of them in the Push Out film. So if you go to pushoutfilm.com, you'll see a deep dive into the Columbus City Preparatory School for Girls, which talks a little bit about some of the processes that were used in that space and to engage girls in sharing out of their own ideas about how to be a part of this work. In my previous body of work, I helped to launch an educational reentry program for girls in the Bay Area of California, where girls were invited to be a part of co-constructing the entire program, but specifically also part of the hiring team for their teachers. And it was really, these were girls who had experienced school push out. These were girls who were seeking to reconnect with community, seeking to reconnect to their learning. And, the last thing we wanted to do was create a space where they felt that, again, they would be pushed away. And so we invited them to really build out and help us understand what they wanted to study, where they wanted to go with their lives. We invited them to be a part of the interview panel for educators so that they could ask the questions directly of educators. Like, if I'm having a bad day or if I've had a deep disruption, how are you going to respond to me? How are you going to be in community with me? And for many of the educators interviewing, that was the first time they'd ever been asked a question like that. And it's not common practice in many of our educational spaces, but it is something that needs to be a consideration given the disparities that we continue to see, even in the districts and in the spaces where other innovative work is happening. Programs are being developed, but the racial disparity is not being disrupted. And so if we really want to continue to think through the racial disparity that we want to impact, we have to have the conversations about those disparities. We have to talk about race. We have to talk about ethnicity. We have to talk about how unique populations are being impacted by conditions, practices, and engage them in conversations to build out what could be the alternative. And so I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I have a couple more questions here. I see.
Yeah, let's take one more question.
Okay. So the last question I see is, could you speak more on the relationship between policing in schools and policing outside of schools, the carceral system as a whole? What I will say is that it's common knowledge that there has been historically a contentious relationship between law enforcement and communities of color, particularly Black communities and Latino communities and Indigenous communities. The idea of law enforcement as a structure of surveillance was born of deeply oppressive systems in our nation, and we have not had conversations about that at all. So much of the call to reconcile the histories or the presence of law enforcement in schools has to do with the fact that we need to engage in conversations about how policing takes place outside of schools, how policing takes place in communities, what those relationships are that trigger this feeling of unsafety, even in schools when law enforcement is present. Struggling to get through talking to you all today, but I'm human, so here it is. So I think, what's really important for us in this conversation is to think about how we can build out relationships that, and how we can rethink, ultimately, how we rethink accountability, how we rethink justice, such that it is not in our minds completely aligned, totally aligned, and only encompassing of law enforcement. I move toward Martin Luther King's articulation of justice when I think about justice. I think about it really being about a practice of love. He said that justice at its best is power doing everything to correct what stands against love. So if you're not using your power to correct what stands against love, you're not engaged in justice work, right? So when we think about what we call our criminal justice system or our juvenile justice system, is it really justice? Law enforcement is the first point of contact to the justice system in our construct as a society. And that is off if you are thinking about justice as being this grand manifestation of love. You don't need law enforcement to enact love. You need relationships to enact love. You need for people to get to know each other, to really build out community. That's at the center of love. Not a badge and a gun. That's about order. That's about control. So if we're gonna call it our criminal control system or our juvenile, order system, that's something else. But this concept of justice has to be part of our broad public discourses in order for us to reconcile the historical conditions and narratives that shape how law enforcement shows up in communities of color, particularly Black and Latino communities, and also really thinking about what that means when we invite those deeply problematic, complex relationships and structures into the place that we are saying we want to send our children to, and that we trust to educate them and prepare them for their next phases of life. Not every school is under the same degree of surveillance in this country. Specific schools are under surveillance. And so we have to be real about which schools that we're inviting to be surveilled and which schools we allow for young people to grow and learn and engage in intellectual challenge and inquiry without their bodies being policed and surveilled, without being regulated by dress codes, without the violence that takes place. And it often has to do with the relationships that exist, the expectations we have for our young people, and the conditions that we are leading with. And so I'll pause there, but I thank everybody for their time. I want to thank the interpreters for hanging with me and everybody as I was struggling to speak to you all. I'm usually available in different platforms if you want to continue to have some conversations about this, but I appreciate all of your time and wish you the best, most rigorous engagement around this conversation as you move through the next couple of days.
Thank you so much. I just feel like we just need to sit with what you just shared and imparted. You had a whole amen corner. Folks have been texting like, you brought folks full circle. So thank you so much for your work, Dr. Morris, and for keeping Black girls and Black women at the center. When I imagine a Black future, I imagine that Black girls and Black women are sacred and loved. So I just want to thank you for that affirmation and sharing that with us. We all deserve to be sacred and loved. And also thank you for the reminder and showing how, one, that you're human, and also reminding us to get up, get some water, get some rest, or walk away from the screen, move. We will take a break and come back at 2:30 for the Policing, Reforming in Black and Brown Communities panel. You do not have to log out of the webinar, but please come back and be with us. And again, thank you all so much. And Dr. Morris, thank you.